beneath furs and frost. A winter in Viking Scandinavia, lying back, maybe under a warm blanket, and you can almost hear the distant crackle of a fire, the gentle pop and hiss of burning birchwood as heat pulses outward into the bitter cold. In the far reaches of Scandinavia, over 1,000 years ago, this sound meant more than comfort. It meant survival. The Vikings, known often for their raids and longships, were, for most of the year, farmers, hunters, and survivors of some of the harshest winters in the known world. Life during the coldest months, when the sun barely rose, and the snow coated the land in silence, was not marked by battles or voyages. It was marked by endurance, and for many, that meant surviving indoors, in longhouses that were less a place of luxury and more a last defense against death by exposure. Longhouse was a rectangular, timber-framed structure that served not only as shelter for the family, but for their animals as well. At first glance, it might seem simple. Thick walls of timber or turf, a roof made from thatch or sod, and few, if any, windows. But its simplicity was its genius. Designed to trap heat and block out icy winds, it became a cocoon against the long, Arctic dark. You would have smelled many things walking into a Viking longhouse in January. Smoke clinging to the low rafters, mingled with the earthy scent of moss used for insulation, and the musk of sheep or goats kept inside for warmth. Single central hearth, often an elongated pit in the floor, burned day and night, fed with birch and pine, with careful moderation. Firewood was precious. It had been chopped and dried the previous spring and summer, stacked carefully beneath lean-tos or in barns to avoid the ruin of damp. A single misstep in firewood management could mean a longhouse freezing from within. The daily routine in winter was slow, quiet, and essential. With little daylight, tasks were organized around the few usable hours. Women might mend clothing by lamplights, small oil lamps carved from stone, filled with fish oil or animal fat, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Children learned early to sew, to spin wool, or to help with small chores. Silence was common. Voices were low. Sound echoed strangely in those enclosed wooden spaces. The clothing the Vikings wore was not only functional, it was carefully layered and meticulously prepared during warmer months. Woolen tunics, underclothes of linen, cloaks, fastened with simple brooches, and shoes stuffed with straw for insulation. Fur was a matter of necessity, not luxury. From bear, fox, or reindeer, it lined the inner layers of cloaks and gloves. Everyone had their winter outfit, worn daily, seldom changed, but often repaired, and beneath all of it, a layer of grease or lard was sometimes rubbed on exposed skin to prevent frostbite, especially for those forced to leave the house. There was no such thing as waste during a Viking winter. Everything had value. Animal dung was collected and dried in warmer months to serve as backup fuel when wood grew scarce. Bones from butchered animals were carved into tools or used in stew, boiled for hours to extract every ounce of protein. Fish were dried or fermented, stored in pits sealed with turf to survive months when the fjords froze over. Meals were simple and heavy. Porridge made from barley or oats, thickened with goat's milk or water. Root vegetables, such as turnips and onions, stored in cellars dug beneath the house, were boiled into stews with bits of preserved meat. Flatbread, baked in batches during early winter, was stored in stacks, growing tougher as the season dragged on, often dipped in broth to make it edible. Water, too, required effort. Streams froze. Snow had to be collected and melted, a slow and fuel-consuming process. Some longhouses built insulated barrels that held ice, slowly melting over days to provide a steady trickle of water. When storms howled outside and the snow drifted past the roofline, even stepping outside for snow became a perilous task. But not all was hardship. There was a rhythm, a strange comfort to winter life. Families huddled close together for warmth. Stories were shared to pass the hours, tales of the gods, of heroes and monsters, and of warmer days long past. Oral tradition was not simply entertainment, it was an education, a spiritual bond, and a way to keep culture alive when the land itself slept. Children learned from elders in the long stretches of twilight. They listened to stories of how Thor defeated the frost giants, or how Odin hung from Yggdrasil in the cold for 9 days to gain wisdom. These stories mirrored the world around them. Outside, frost crept over the wooden beams. Ice flowers bloomed on the inside of doors. The giants were always near, if only metaphorically reminders of the cold's eternal hunger. The hearth was the center of it all. It was not just a place to cook, it was sacred. Many Viking homes included small altars near the hearth, dedicated to house spirits or gods of fire and home, such as Frigg or Loki. Offerings of mead or bread might be left beside the fire in hopes of safety and warmth. Even the ash from the hearth was preserved, mixed with water to make lye for soap, or used in rituals of cleansing before Yule. Ah, yes, Yule was the high point of the Viking winter, a time of feasting of provisions, allowed and honoring the gods. It was a festival of fire, of warding off the dark. Pine logs were dragged inside and burned for days in what later traditions would call the Yule log. Candles, or their Viking equivalents, maul wicks, in cups of oil, were lit throughout the house to welcome returning light. Rituals were performed to bless the fields and animals for the coming year, even though snow still blanketed everything. There was singing, quiet and rhythmic, like a lullaby to the gods. Not all could afford great celebrations. Some households had little food. In such places, Yule was more solemn, a time of quiet offerings and soft prayers. The contrast between wealth and scarcity could be stark, even in a culture known for communal ties. Despite these challenges, the Vikings endured. They had to, for spring would come, eventually. And when it did, the snow would melt, revealing fences needing mending, fields needing plowing, and animals eager to leave the confines of the barn. But until then, winter was about getting through each night, keeping the hearth alive, and holding the frost giants at bay with stories, silence, and stubborn human will. And as you imagine the wind howling beyond those thick turf walls, you might wonder, how did they know the seasons would change? With so much darkness and so little food, how did the Viking people maintain hope that spring would return? The fire was never allowed to die, not only because of the cold, but because relighting a fire from nothing, especially in the damp, unrelenting dark of a Scandinavian winter, was no small task. It required flint, tinder, and luck, all in short supply when your fingers were numb and the wind blew sideways through the cracks in the longhouse. So every evening, someone, often the eldest woman or a trusted child, banked the coals with ash, covering them to keep the embers alive until morning. It was a quiet ritual, rarely spoken of, but deeply respected. That small detail, banking the fire, tells you something important about the Viking approach to winter. It was a season not of conquest or expansion, but of contraction, conservation, and silent cooperation. Every movement, every task, was focused on preserving energy. warmth, and life. In such conditions, hierarchy and discipline played a critical role. The Viking homestead was not a loose collection of individuals. It functioned like a ship. Every person had a role, and failure to perform could endanger the group. This applied even more in winter, when supplies were limited and time was slow. At the top of the household was the bond, the head farmer or landowner. Contrary to romanticized images, this person was not always a fierce warrior. More often, he or sometimes she was a manager of resources, responsible for calculating how much grain could be used each week, when to ration dried fish, and whether the pigs could be slaughtered before spring. These were not exciting choices, but they were the ones that mattered. Below the bond were family members and extended kin, spouses, children, elderly parents, and sometimes fostered children from nearby families. Each had a role. Older men carved tools or repaired harnesses. Elderly women spun wool, prepared herbs, or recited oral histories. Younger children collected kindling or learned to shape bone needles. The idea that any member could be idle, especially in winter, was almost unthinkable. Idleness was dangerous. Idleness led to weakness sometimes. If the household was wealthy or part of a winger local assembly or social network, they might also house thralls or enslaved laborers. The Viking system of slavery was complex, often involving people captured during raids or sold into bondage due to debt. In winter, thralls shared the same cold, smoky longhouse, but had the lowest status. They tended animals, fetched water, and handled the filthiest chores. Yet even their labor was critical to survival, and survival was not guaranteed. Food supplies were calculated with harsh realism. Most Viking communities slaughtered a portion of their animals at the start of winter, preserving the meat in salt, or through drying. It was an efficient system, less food needed for feeding animals, and more protein for the people. But mistakes in slaughter numbers or unexpected weather could lead to shortages. Root cellars were dug deep, their floors lined with straw to reduce freezing. Grain was stored in raised wooden bins to prevent damp and mice. Meat was hung from beams in the coldest part of the house. The preservation techniques were meticulous, passed down through generations. Because a single miscalculation, a leak in the cellar, an infestation, could ruin a winter's worth of planning, and so people learned to stretch what they had. Grains were thinned with water to make soups. Stews were bulked with dried herbs or leftover bones. One bread loaf might last for days. Hunger was not always starvation, was often a slow ache, a constant presence in the body during the last weeks of February or early March, when supplies ran low and the snow refused to melt. In such times, the community mattered. While Viking society was often individualistic in battle or voyage, winter brought people together. Nearby households sometimes shared supplies or labor. Older neighbors without children might be taken in for the season, or offered extra milk in return for stories and skills. The bonds formed in winter, when help truly meant survival, shaped alliances, marriages, and decisions at the summer wing. Of course, not all winters were equal. Archaeological records and tree ring data suggest that certain years, particularly in the late 800s and mid-900s, were especially harsh. Crop failures in summer led to leaner stores in winter. Storms, sea ice, or disease could isolate communities completely. In such times, even close-knit villages had to make impossible decisions. There are sagas, not always poetic, but often stark, that speak of these times. One tells of a family in Iceland who, in a year of deep snow and poor harvests, resorted to grinding bark into their flour, creating a bitter paste to survive. Another recounts how rival families came to a blood truce during a blizzard, sheltering together in one longhouse and alternating night watch over the dwindling fire. These aren't stories of raids or conquest. They are stories of quiet desperation, of compromise born of necessity. Disease was also a winter threat. Closed quarters, smoke-filled air, and limited hygiene created a breeding ground for illness. The Vikings had herbal knowledge. Yarrow, juniper, and angelica were common, but medicine was as much ritual as science. Illness often meant isolation and sometimes spiritual blame. A child's lingering cough might be explained by a displeased spirit or by a failure to make offerings during Yule. Despite this, there was dignity in the way people accepted the limits of their world. They did not demand warmth when it wasn't there. They didn't expect abundance when the soil slept. Instead, they watched the stars. They tracked the moon. They counted days since the solstice, measuring the slow lengthening of daylight in minutes, not hours. Some even carved simple calendars, primstaves, with notches marking solstices, equinoxes, and holy days. These carved sticks weren't precise tools of science, but emotional anchors, proof that time still moved forward, that the earth hadn't forgotten them. And then there was waiting, so much waiting. Long hours by the hearth, spinning yarn while staring into smoke, listening to wind whistle through the roof beams, wondering whether the stores would last, wondering whether the neighbors were faring better, waiting for footsteps outside to break the silence, waiting for the first bird of spring to call from a snow-wet branch, sometimes waiting for someone who left in autumn and didn't return, because even in winter, some journeys couldn't be delayed. Messengers, traders, and, rarely, desperate raiders would set out even in the frozen months. These travelers used fur-lined boots, snowshoes, and sleds pulled by dogs or ponies. They marked their paths with bundles of sticks left along trails, in case the snow buried the way. They knew that the price of delay might be starvation or worse. The sagas often mentioned those who never returned. Their absence was marked by silence, a bowl left unwashed, a sleeping mat undisturbed. The stories told in winter weren't always of heroes. They were sometimes of those who left and didn't come back, and what it meant to endure without them. Yet spring did come, eventually, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A drip from the eaves, a patch of bare earth along the edge of the longhouse, a thin ray of sunlight reaching the back wall where, in deepest winter, there had only been shadow. Hope returned in pieces. The animals grew restless. Children were allowed outside without a full wrap of furs. The snow softened. The ice cracked and wept. Somewhere, someone opened a cellar and found just enough grain to last until planting. And in that moment, a sigh of deep, ancestral release passed through the valley. But before the thaw came, before the rivers ran again and the ploughs returned to the fields, there was still one last test to face. The hungry gap, that narrow stretch, between winter's end and the first spring growth. The final weeks when even the best prepared stores ran low, when roots sprouted in storage and meat grew tough with age, when sickness surged one last time, when the ice seemed to hesitate before finally giving way. It was a time when the mind asked, how much longer? And so the people waited. They boiled the last bones. They ate flat bread that crumbled in their hands. They watched the sky, and somewhere between one heartbeat and the next. The snow melted, but until that moment, as cold wrapped the land in silence and breath fogged the air with every exhale, the Vikings endured, with cracked hands, threadbare cloaks, and watchful eyes. They endured, because they had no other choice. When the sun first touched the frozen ridgelines again, it came not as warmth, but as light, thin, pale, and almost uncertain. Still, to the Viking farmer standing at the doorway of the longhouse, hand resting on the beam blackened with smoke and time, that light meant everything. It meant that they had made it. Winter, for all its quiet cruelty, did not last forever. Its final weeks, sometimes colder than the first, pushed the body and spirit to the edge. And yet, once the first thaw began, once snowdrifts shrank and the grip of frost cracked under the hesitant rays of spring, the entire rhythm of Viking life shifted again. Slowly, and then all at once. You can imagine it, the thick snowmelt slipping from the sod roof, landing in rhythmic splashes on the packed earth. The sheep, no longer huddled and shivering indoors, released into the wet yard and steady, scraggly, and hungry for the first green shoots. The longhouse, which had held breath for months, seemed to exhale. But even now, the end of winter did not mean ease. The hungry gap, those few weeks between the exhaustion of stored food and the readiness of new crops or pasture, was past. A precarious time. Many deaths from illness and malnutrition occurred not in the depths of winter, but in these early days of spring, when people dared to hope too soon or stretched their supplies too far. Yet as always, Viking society met this season not with fear, but with ritual and tradition. Survival was not just about grit, it was about rhythm. The natural world was not tamed, was appeased, observed, and occasionally begged for mercy. Spring began with offerings. At the edges of fields still too wet to plough, people poured out small portions of ale or scattered grains from the previous harvest. These were gestures to the land spirits, the landvetter, who were believed to inhabit every field, hill, and stream. If they were pleased, the crops would grow strong. If not, well, the Vikings didn't believe in coincidence. At home, women cleaned the hearth not just for hygiene, but as an act of symbolic renewal. Ashes were swept and scattered into the field's ashes, from months of fires, from meals cooked in silence and warmth shared among kin. These ashes, so ordinary, were rich with meaning. They held stories, and of course, there was planting. Ploughing the first furrows of the year was almost ceremonial. The ard, a simple wooden plough drawn by oxen or even strong men, broke through the frost-bitten earth with creaking protest. The soil, damp and stubborn, yielded slowly. Everyone helped. Men guided the plough, women and children scattered seed or cleared stones, and elders watched, offering advice, and sometimes small charms or rhymes believed to encourage growth. But the work was not constant. Between bursts of labor, there were moments of gratitude. As in winter, time was measured not just in chores, but in gatherings. Spring feasts, when they could be managed, were among the most meaningful. One such celebration was Tisablat, a sacrificial ritual to honor the Disir, female ancestral spirits or goddesses who protected the family line, while records are scattered. It is believed this rite was held in the spring, likely tied to fertility, rebirth, and luck for the coming year. A portion of the year's mead might be poured out. A lamb or piglet, if one could be spared, offered to the spirits. The participants would wear clean garments, and the women of the house might lead the ritual, invoking their foremothers in quiet prayer. For many Viking households, this was as close to religion as they ever practiced, not grand temples or formal creeds, but humble household rituals tied directly to the cycles of the land. Still, not all came through winter intact. In some years, graves were dug in frozen ground. Now, as the soil thawed, families returned to finish burial mounds to mark the final resting places of those who had not survived. These were quiet, personal ceremony stones placed in circles, mounds raised by hand, a carved piece of wood, a favorite brooch, a bundle of dried herbs to guide the spirit. Death, when it came in winter, had to be dealt with in pieces. Now, spring brought finality. In these moments, grief mixed with hope. There's a quiet strength to that burying one. Seasons loss while preparing the soil for the next harvest. It's the kind of resilience that doesn't shout or sing, but simply continues, and continue they did. Children who had grown restless in the confines of the longhouse spilled into the fields. They helped gather firewood, wet and heavy from the melt, and laughed as they slipped in the mud. They collected eggs from hens that had begun to lay again and watched the first flowers bloom. Wood anemone, pale violets pressed low to the ground, lifelong dormant, stirred from beneath. Even the sea changed. Ice pulled back from the fjords. Boats upturned and sealed with pitch during winter were dragged down from storage and inspected for rot. Nets were mended, oars rewrapped. Fishing resumed, not yet for trade or wealth, but for the day's catch fresh protein for bodies lean from months of salted meat and porridge. By late spring, as daylight stretched its arms again and warmth sank into the bones of the land, the memory of winter softened. It didn't disappear, not entirely, but it settled into a kind of background awareness, like a story you've told many times, but still remember in your chest. Because winter had left its mark, it had shaped the faces of those who had endured. It, leaner now, their eyes more tired. It had created new scars and strengthened old bonds. Babies born in December were now wide-eyed infants swaddled in lighter cloth. Elders who had seen 50 winters looked out at the ploughed fields with the silent wisdom of people who understood how fragile it all was. Perhaps that's why the Vikings treasured their seasonal gatherings so deeply. The first market day in spring, held at the Wing, was not just about trade or justice. It was a reunion. It was proof that neighboring families had survived too, that the world had not shrunk, but endured. Friends exchanged salted fish for wool, barley for honey, gossip for news. Songs were sung again, not only of gods and heroes, but of the winter just past. And while much has been said about Viking raids, about their journeys west and east, one could argue that their greatest feat, the one least celebrated, was this. They survived the cold. Year after year, generation after generation, with only firelight, salted fish, and the stubbornness of human will. They stared into the long dark and refused to yield. That, more than conquest or legend, defines them. And as you lie there, imagining the last drift of snow melting beneath a rising sun, you might ask yourself, not just how they did it, but what it meant. What does it say about a people when their greatest battle each year wasn't fought with sword or sail, but with patience, with silence, and with each other? Maybe the true legacy of the Vikings isn't found in their ships or their stories of gods. Maybe it's found in the long, smoke-dark houses, in the soft padding of feet on frozen floors, in the careful measuring of grain, in the way a mother banked the fire before sleep, and in that final breath at winter's end, when the world exhaled in, so did they, The rise of Abraham Lincoln. 1809 to 1865, before he wore a stovepipe hat, before the debates, before the presidency, before the war. There was simply a boy born into obscurity, in a place where the trees outnumbered people and the greatest sound most days was wind through the leaves. Abraham Lincoln came into the world on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the sinking spring farm. In Hardin County, Kentucky, the air was cold, but that wasn't unusual. Winters in that part of Kentucky had a habit of arriving early and lingering, and the cabin in which he was born was little more than rough logs chinked with mud. The floor was packed dirt. The roof leaked when it rained. There was no cradle with carved spindles or soft linens waiting for him. There was no doctor, only a midwife from the area and the practiced hands of his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a carpenter and farmer by trade, but his world was not one of prosperity. His greatest wealth lay in his hands, his axe, and the few acres of land he tried to cultivate. For young Abraham, life began in silence, in cold, in labor. It was not an unusual start for a child on the American frontier. Childhood in early Kentucky wasn't marked by playdates or picture books. It was marked by survival, by rising early to fetch water from the spring, by tending to animals, chopping wood, helping with planting, and staying out of the way when adults spoke. Formal education was rare and intermittent. There were no public schools, just itinerant teachers who came and went, sometimes teaching in barns, sometimes in open fields. Abraham attended these frontier schools when he could. They were short-lived affairs, known as blab schools, where students learned by repeating lessons aloud in chorus. A noisy, chaotic environment, but effective in its way. Even in this, Lincoln stood, apart not by volume but by attention. He listened, he remembered. Reading was, from the beginning, a kind of salvation. The Lincolns owned very few books. Among them, the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, and the Life of George Washington. Abraham read these again and again, not because he had to, but because they were what he had. He copied entire passages onto scraps of bark or slate, not for schoolwork, but for the joy of keeping them. He read by candlelight, by firelight, sometimes even by sunlight filtering through a crack in the log wall. He was quiet, lanky, and often barefoot. His family could not afford shoes year-round, and during warmer months, he went without. His clothes were patched and plain, mostly homespun. He was not destined for greatness, at least, not by the standards of the day. When Abraham was 7 years old, the family moved to Indiana. Land disputes in Kentucky had made it impossible for Thomas to retain clear title to his property, and Indiana, part of the new western frontier, promised new beginnings. But new beginnings required effort and offered no guarantees. The journey to Indiana was long and difficult. It involved crossing rivers, clearing dense forests, and building shelter from nothing. The Lincolns settled near Little Pigeon Creek in Spencer County, Indiana. They built a new cabin. They cleared land. They tried, again, to establish a life. But the frontier was as brutal as it was promising. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. Nancy Hanks Lincoln died of milk sickness, a mysterious illness caused by drinking milk from cows that had grazed on whitesnake root, a toxic plant. At the time, no one understood the cause. The sickness swept through the area. Abraham's mother, along with several neighbors, died painfully and without real treatment. Abraham was devastated. His mother had been the emotional center of his small world. Her absence created a silence that even time could not fill. For months, the family struggled alone. There were no extended kin nearby, and for a time, no one to care for the children properly. Then came Sarah Bush Johnston, Thomas. Lincoln returned to Kentucky and married a widow with 3 children of her own. When Sarah Bush Lincoln arrived at the Indiana homestead in 1819, she brought with her not just bedding and furniture, but a new energy. She was kind, firm, and intelligent. She treated Abraham and his sister Sarah as her own. It was Sarah Bush Lincoln who encouraged Abraham's reading, who supported his curiosity, who brought a kind of order and compassion back into the cabin. Abraham would later speak of her with deep respect, calling her his angel mother, a term that set her apart from his birth mother. Though he loved both dearly, the years in Indiana were hard, winters were severe, work was endless. Food, at times, was scarce. Abraham grew tall disproportionately so. By the time he was a teenager, he stood over 6 feet tall, lean and wiry, with enormous hands and feet. He developed a reputation for physical strength, which was often put to use in splitting rails, clearing land, and hauling supplies. And yet, his mind remained elsewhere. Books continued to be his great passion. He borrowed whatever he could law, books, religious texts, poetry. He was captivated by Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and the works of Shakespeare. He began to write little essays and speeches. He practiced storytelling, mimicking the preachers and politicians he had heard on occasion. His voice was still high and uncertain, but his ideas slowly forming were clear. Abraham also began to notice the contradictions of the world around him. His father rented him out for labor to neighbors, a common practice then, keeping the wages. Abraham accepted this, but remembered it. He saw the toll poverty took on families. He saw slavery when the family traveled back through Kentucky. Though he did not yet speak publicly against it, the sight unsettled him. In 1830, at the age of 21, Abraham Lincoln became legally independent. The family moved again, this time to Illinois. Abraham helped settle them, but within a year, he struck out on his own, making his way to the small town of New Salem. Here, the adult Lincoln began to emerge. He worked odd jobs: store clerk, rail splitter, postmaster, surveyor. He read law books during slow hours and joined in local debates. People began to notice him not just for his height, but for his humor, honesty, and ability to speak plainly about complex ideas. In a town where education was rare, Lincoln's self-taught knowledge stood out. In 1834, he was elected to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He still slept in shared rooms. He still owned little. But the cabin-born boy who once scratched out verses by candlelight was now reading Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and corresponding with political figures. He studied late into the night. He listened more than he spoke. And, when he did speak, people listened. Even in these early years, Lincoln seemed to exist in 2 worlds, the world of hard labor and backwoods life, and the world of ideas and oration. He was comfortable in both, though never fully at ease. He carried his past like a quiet coat, always visible if you knew where to look. His accent remained thick. His manners were modest. He laughed easily and often, sometimes inappropriately. He made mistakes, admitted them, and tried again. He was not a man of rapid ascent, but of slow and persistent growth. And so, The rise of Abraham Lincoln began not in a blaze of glory or dramatic transformation, but in the dull grind of daily life, in a boy's quiet love of books, in a young man's careful self-discipline, in an adult's steady sense of justice. He would become much more: a lawyer, a congressman, a president. But first, he was a boy with muddy feet and a worn Bible, a child who watched his mother die, a young man who taught himself law in the back room of a store, a person who, for all his greatness, began in the humblest way imaginable. And perhaps that's the question worth asking. How does a barefoot boy in a dirt-floored cabin, with little formal education and no inherited wealth, grow into the figure who would one day hold a nation together? What do we carry from our childhood that shapes what we become? By the time Abraham Lincoln arrived in New Salem, Illinois, in 1831, he was already used to moving. His early life had been one of impermanence: Kentucky, Indiana, then Illinois. Always forests, always fields. He had grown tall and strong, a man who could swing an axe for hours, but whose thoughts drifted increasingly toward books, speech, and something more. New Salem was small, perched above the Sangamon River. It had little more than a sawmill, a handful of businesses, and a modest population. But it offered Lincoln something rare: a pause. Here, he could begin to shape himself into more than a laborer. His job at the local store, owned by Denton Offutt, was unremarkable. He stocked shelves, weighed out goods, and swept floors. But he talked, listened, even Morand made impressions. Customers noted his honesty, his dry humor, and a kind of unshakable courtesy. One story, which became legend, told of how he once walked several miles to return a few cents to a woman he had accidentally overcharged. The people began to call him Honest Abe, but honesty was only part of what set him apart. Lincoln was curious. He read voraciously. He borrowed books, anything he could get his hands on. He studied grammar, mathematics, history, and especially law. Not in a school, but alone, often by firelight, balancing books on his knees or reading aloud to himself. In 1832, Offutt's store failed, and Lincoln, perhaps optimistically, decided to run for the Illinois General Assembly. He was 23 years old, had almost no formal education, and no real money, but he had a growing reputation in New Salem. The campaign was not successful, though he did well locally. Still, the setback did not deter him. That same year, he volunteered for the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War. He was elected captain of his company, a symbolic honor more than a strategic one. Lincoln later remarked that this was the only military title he ever held, and he considered it one of his proudest distinctions, though he never saw combat. After the militia, Lincoln returned to New Salem and tried business again, this time as a owner of a general store. The venture failed quickly, leaving him in debt for years. But he began to study law in earnest, borrowing books from a local lawyer named John T. Stewart. He also took on roles as postmaster and deputy surveyor, modest jobs, but ones that kept him engaged with the community and allowed him to continue his studies. By 1834, Lincoln tried once again for the state legislature. This time, he won. He began his service in Vandalia, then the state capital. He was aligned with the Whig Party, which emphasized infrastructure improvements, education, and economic development. It was a party of ideals rather than ideology, a perfect fit for a man who preferred reason over passion. In Vandalia, Lincoln observed. He did not immediately stand out, but he watched, listened, and learned the mechanics of government. He was deliberate, rarely rushing to judgment. He read legal cases and studied the words of great political thinkers, Jefferson, Madison, Blackstone, even Voltaire. His speaking style was not fiery. Instead, he was logical, clear, and plain-spoken. He explained rather than inspired. His humor, which often came in the form of parables and dry anecdotes, disarmed opponents and entertained colleagues. He could be blunt, but never cruel. In 1836, Lincoln was admitted to the Illinois bar. He began to practice law, eventually moving to Springfield, the new state capital. It was in Springfield that he began to truly build his legal career, riding the circuit, appearing in front of local juries, and handling everything from land disputes to criminal cases. It was also in Springfield that he deepened his friendships and began to navigate the social circles of the professional class. One such friendship was with Joshua Speed, a merchant who offered Lincoln a place to stay above his store. The two men became close companions, often sharing long conversations late into the night. The arrangement suited Lincoln, who had few possessions and lived simply. He was still awkward in social settings. His clothes were often ill-fitting. He was known to walk into rooms silently and remain in a corner for long periods. But when he spoke, people listened. In 1837, Lincoln gave one of his first public indications of political principle. In response to a mob's killing of a black man named Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor, Lincoln gave a speech in defense of the rule of law. He did not yet call for the abolition of slavery, but he warned that mob violence posed a grave danger to the fabric of the republic. This marked a subtle turning point in Lincoln's thinking. His legal mind and moral compass began to align in more deliberate ways. While slavery was still legal and widespread in southern states, Lincoln believed the founding fathers had intended for it to eventually wither. He opposed its expansion, even as he stopped short of calling for immediate abolition. In 1842, after years of bachelorhood and uncertain courtships, Lincoln married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Their relationship was complex. Mary was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and deeply political. She believed in Lincoln's potential, even when he doubted it himself. They had 4 sons, though only one, Robert, would survive to adulthood. Lincoln's political aspirations turned national in 1846, when he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He served a single term, from 1847 to 1849. During that time, the country was embroiled in the Mexican-American War. Lincoln criticized the war, arguing that it was based on questionable grounds. His stance was unpopular and hurt his political standing. After his term, Lincoln returned to Illinois and to law practice. For several years, he remained largely out of public view, building his career, trying cases, and raising his family. But he was not politically inactive. He followed national events closely, especially the increasingly bitter debates over slavery. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The law, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, allowed territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in certain northern territories. To Lincoln, this was a betrayal of the nation's founding principles. He returned to politics with renewed purpose, delivering a series of speeches that combined legal precision with moral clarity. He argued not only that slavery was wrong, but that it corrupted democratic institutions. His words were not fiery, but they struck deeply in one speech. He said, "If the Negro is a man, why then, my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. His audience was often divided, but Lincoln stood his ground. He was not a radical abolitionist, but a moderate with firm convictions. He feared that the nation was drifting toward conflict, not necessarily a civil war, but a deep, irreparable division. In 1856, Lincoln joined the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. He quickly became one of its most articulate voices in the Midwest. In 1858, he was chosen to challenge Stephen Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat. The resulting Lincoln-Douglas debates, a series of 7 debates across Illinois, catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. He lost the election, but gained a reputation for clarity, moral authority, and wit. In those debates, Lincoln spoke not of hatred or vengeance, but of principle. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It was a biblical reference, but also a political warning. The United States could not endure half slave and half free. Sooner or later, it would become one or the other. By the end of the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a regional figure. He was being discussed as a potential presidential candidate. His story, humble origins, legal success, moral clarity resonated with a nation unsure of its future. Still, he had never governed a state, never led an army, and had spent just one term in Congress. He was unknown in much of the country. He had no wealth, no aristocratic name, and no military glory. And yet, in the quiet moments in his speeches, in his letters, in his firm but measured logic, there was something that people trusted in 1860. His name was floated seriously for the Republican presidential nomination. But who was this man, really? This rail-splitter turned lawyer. This honest, soft-spoken politician from Illinois. What did he truly believe America could become? What would he do if given the power to shape its future? In the spring of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was invited to deliver a speech at Cooper Union in New York City. It was a pivotal moment, of the last chances for a relatively unknown politician from Illinois to present himself as a serious national figure. Lincoln, methodical as ever, spent weeks preparing. The speech he delivered on February 27th was not emotional. It did not thunder with religious zeal or revolutionary fervor. It was legalistic, detailed, and relentless in its logic. He traced the Founding Fathers' positions on slavery, using direct quotations and careful citations to argue that they had intended to limit, not expand, the institution. He concluded with measured force, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." The address was a success. Newspapers across the Northeast praised him, not as a firebrand, but as a man of conviction and clarity. He was tall, awkward, and plainly dressed, but somehow that made him more believable, more real, less like a politician. Later that year, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln's name began to rise among the delegates. He was not the most famous man in the room. That title likely belonged to William Seward of New York. But Lincoln was seen as more moderate, less divisive, and crucially, more electable. After a dramatic few days of voting and maneuvering, Abraham Lincoln secured the Republican nomination for president on May 18, 1860. His opponents dismissed him. The South threatened secession. And yet, on November 6, 1860, he was elected the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln did not win a single Southern state. The nation fractures between his election in November and his inauguration in March 1861. 7 southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. By the time he took office, Abraham Lincoln was not stepping into a peaceful country. He was assuming leadership over a splintered nation teetering on the edge of war. He entered Washington, D.C., under armed guard. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln struck a conciliatory tone. He reassured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. But he was firm on one point. Secession was unconstitutional, the Union was perpetual, and he, as president, had taken an oath to preserve it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. His words, however sincere, were overtaken by action. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. The weight of leadership. Lincoln had no military background. He learned strategy from books and from the generals who served him. Some were failures. George McClellan, cautious and slow. Others, like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, proved decisive. But the war was never just about military movements for Lincoln. It was, at its core, a test of democratic endurance. He was criticized constantly. Newspapers called him weak. Protesters accused him of tyranny. He suspended habeas corpus. He ordered arrests. He was accused of overstepping constitutional bounds. Yet he always returned to one principle: the Union must be preserved. In 1862, he made a decisive shift. After 2 years of bloody stalemates and rising death tolls, Lincoln came to see emancipation, not only as a moral necessity but as a strategic one. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate territory were to be forever free. It was a limited order. It did not end slavery in the border states or northern territories, but it redefined the war. No longer was the fight merely for union. It was a struggle for human freedom. Lincoln understood the risks. He feared border states might secede. He knew many Northerners opposed racial equality, but he pressed forward. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Gettysburg and the turn of the tide. In July 1863, the Union won a pivotal victory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The 3-day battle claimed over 50,000 casualties, but it turned the momentum of the war. 4 months later, Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery. His remarks were brief, just 272 words, but they echoed through history. 4.7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. He called on Americans to commit to the unfinished work of those who had died and to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a quiet revolution in thought. Lincoln reframed the Constitution through the lens of the Declaration of Independence, placing equality at the center of national identity. Personal losses and political resolve, the while Lincoln bore the war's weight in his body and soul. Photographs from his presidency showed the toll. His face lined, his posture warier, his eyes more distant. At home, his family suffered. In 1862, his son, Willie, just 11 years old, died of typhoid fever, likely from the White House's unsanitary water. Mary Todd Lincoln was devastated, sinking into deep depression. Lincoln mourned in silence, often walking the halls of the White House at night. He visited hospitals, read telegrams from battlefronts, and wrote condolence letters to grieving families. Yet he never lost sight of the Union's cause. He navigated bitter political opposition, even within his own party. Some wanted him to end the war by compromise. Others demanded harsher measures against the South. Still, he held the center, re-election and a vision for peace in 1864. With the war dragging on and casualties mounting, Lincoln ran for re-election. Many thought he would lose. The Democrats nominated George McClellan, the very general Lincoln had dismissed earlier in the war. But battlefield victories in the fall of 1864, especially Sherman's capture of Atlanta, turned public opinion. Lincoln won decisively. His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, is often considered his greatest speech. It was not a victory speech. It was a meditation on war, judgment, and reconciliation, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. He spoke of slavery not only as a political issue, but as a moral scar on the nation's soul. He recognized that the war's suffering might be divine punishment for centuries of injustice. But he offered hope, not triumph, not vengeance, just hope, the end and a final act of violence. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. Lincoln had lived to see the Union preserved. He had seen Congress pass the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. He had dreamed of a gentler Reconstruction, one that welcomed the South back, slowly but peacefully. But fate did not allow him to lead that chapter. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. That evening, he was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor. Lincoln died the next morning. His body was taken by train back to Springfield, Illinois, stopping in cities along the way. Crowds gathered by the thousands to view the coffin. Many wept openly. For some, it was the first time they truly grasped what he had meant to the nation. Legacy in the quiet. Details. It is easy to remember Lincoln for the great speeches, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation, the second inaugural. But perhaps more significant was how he governed. Slowly, thoughtfully, and with immense patience. He had no aristocratic pedigree. He was not a war hero. He was awkward, often uncertain, and prone to melancholy. And yet, in the gravest moment of American history, he proved to be exactly the leader the nation needed. Not because he was grand, but because he was grounded. He was a student of law, of history, and of people. He made decisions not to please his base, but to hold the nation together. He listened, he waited, he acted when necessary and not a moment before. More than a century and a half later, his name is etched in stone. But it is the ordinary parts of his story that are perhaps most remarkable. A boy from a log cabin, a man who failed in business, lost elections, and grieved his children. A politician who spoke softly, even when the world screamed. And yet somehow, through that stillness, he moved the world. Toilets and sanitation. In antiquity, it is easy to think of sanitation as a modern invention, something born of industrial progress and 19th century hygiene reformers. But long before flush toilets, sewage systems, or even the idea of bacteria, people living thousands of years ago were grappling with a simple and pressing question: Where should it go when it's gone in the body? The answer varied depending on time, place, and resources, but across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, the evidence is clear. Sanitation was not an afterthought. It was, in some places, astonishingly sophisticated. In the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq. Cities like Lagash and Babylon rose from the floodplains, and with them came complexity, writing, administration, trade, and waste. In the ruins of your Sumerian city that peaked around 2000 BCE, archaeologists uncovered some of the earliest examples of urban sanitation infrastructure. Many homes had latrines, small rooms fitted with baked clay seats or simple holes over ceramic or stone drains. These drains connected to vertical shafts or cesspits, where waste collected. In wealthier homes, the waste was carried away through a system of clay pipes or channels that emptied into the city's larger drainage network. This wasn't a universal luxury, of course. Poorer homes may have relied on shared facilities or none at all, and there was no strict regulation. Still, the effort to manage waste, to move it away from the home, showed a growing awareness of hygiene, or at least the discomfort caused by its absence. The streets of some Mesopotamian cities also included open drainage channels, sometimes covered with flat stones, allowing rainwater and waste to be carried away during floods. These systems were basic, but for their time, remarkably effective. Rituals and cleanliness in ancient Egypt further west. Along the Nile, the ancient Egyptians approached sanitation not just as a practical concern, but also as a spiritual and cultural one. Cleanliness, both physical and symbolic, was deeply embedded in Egyptian religion and daily life. Priests bathed several times a day, and personal hygiene was regarded as essential to order the ideal state of balance in the world. So how did they handle toilets in elite homes, particularly during the New Kingdom, say? 1550 a 1070 BCE, people used limestone toilet seats, sturdy slabs with a keyhole-shaped opening set above a pottery vessel or pit. These seats were often located in a small room or private corner, sometimes even with a rudimentary screen for privacy. Flush water was not yet in use, but sand or fine ash was sometimes poured into the toilet bowl to reduce odor and aid in cleanup. Servants may have been tasked with removing the filled pots, a job no one aspired to, but one that made the system function. While rural villages likely used outdoor pits or fields, urban centers like Amarna, the short-lived capital built by Pharaoh Akhenaten, reveal a more structured approach. Excavations there have uncovered drainage pipes made of fired clay running from houses to larger channels or These systems appear to have been carefully planned, a sign that sanitation, at least for the upper classes, was integrated into architecture. Public toilets, as we think of them today, were rare in Egypt, but communal spaces may have included latrine areas, particularly in workers' villages like Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs. There, stone toilet seats have been found in multiple homes, suggesting private waste management was considered part of domestic life, not separate from it. Water, waste, and urban complexity. What both Mesopotamia and Egypt demonstrate is that, even in antiquity, where water was a precious and carefully managed resource, people devised ways to separate the unclean from the clean, both for comfort and for survival. In the absence of germ theory, they still understood something essential. Stagnant waste caused illness. Unpleasant smells, spoiled water, and insect infestations were signs of danger, even if their causes were not fully understood. Sanitation then became part of urban planning, at least in the wealthiest parts of ancient cities. Sewers may have been shallow. Toilet pits may have required manual emptying. But the effort was there in stone pipes, clay bowls, and the careful placement of latrines near water channels. Perhaps most telling is that these systems decayed when cities declined. When empire waned or political instability took hold, so too did the infrastructure for cleanliness. Drains became clogged, cesspits overflowed, toilets broke and went unrepaired. Sanitation was a reflection not just of personal habits, but of civilization itself. As the ancient world expanded, so did the sophistication of its cities and their efforts to manage the less glamorous side of urban life. In the broad river valleys and sunlit hills of the ancient world, entire civilizations experimented with the same question: how to remove human waste from living spaces with as little inconvenience as possible. Some, like the people of the Indus Valley, approached it with practicality and order. Others, like the Greeks and Romans, gradually turned sanitation into a mark of civic pride. In many ways, these systems were fragile, dependent on wealth, labor, and consistent maintenance. But they demonstrate just how deeply our ancestors considered the routines of daily life, and how sanitation quietly shaped the success or decline of entire cities. Mohenjo-daro, one of the largest cities of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, offers one of the most striking early examples of urban sanitation. Located in present-day Pakistan and flourishing around 2600 BCE, the city featured a remarkable degree of planning. Streets were laid out in a grid, homes were built with standardized fired bricks, and most astonishingly, many houses had their own private bathing areas and latrines. Wastewater from these rooms was channeled through a carefully constructed system of covered drains that ran alongside the streets. These drains, covered with stone or brick slabs, were regularly spaced with inspection holes for cleaning and maintenance. The consistency and scale of these systems suggest that sanitation was not reserved for the wealthy. Rather, it was a citywide norm built into the urban fabric and apparently available to most residents. The people of Mohenjo-daro were likely more concerned with routine cleanliness and separation of waste than spiritual ideas of purity. But the outcome was much the same: a city in which managing waste was integral to public life. Strikingly, archaeologists have found few large trash heaps or open cesspools. Instead, solid waste appears to have been routinely removed, although how and by whom remains uncertain. In contrast, ancient Greece approached sanitation from a different angle. While not as uniform as the Indus Valley, Greek cities like Athens and Corinth developed their own methods of handling waste. In many homes, particularly those of wealthier citizens, simple chamber pots were used for nighttime relief. These pots were emptied, often without ceremony, into the streets or into public cesspits. It was a common, if unpleasant, occurrence in ancient Greek cities to hear the splash of waste being poured from an upper window onto the road below, sometimes without warning. Despite these crude practices, the Greeks did implement some organized solutions. Public latrines, especially in gymnasia and larger civic buildings, became more common by the classical period. These facilities often featured long stone benches with rounded openings and drainage channels underneath. While they lacked privacy, they allowed for communal waste disposal and were usually placed near water sources or drainage canals. Greek physicians notably Hippocrates, began to link cleanliness with health, though the concept of microbes was still millennia away. There was an intuitive understanding that stagnant water and filth bred illness. Bathing, while partly ritual and social, also became a method of disease prevention. Public baths often stood adjacent to latrines or laundries, reflecting an emerging network of water use that served both hygienic and social functions. Yet it was in Rome that ancient sanitation reached its most elaborate and enduring form. The Roman Empire, with its engineers, laborers, and seemingly inexhaustible appetite for order, constructed a sanitation infrastructure that astonishes even modern engineers. At the heart of it was the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Sewer, an enormous underground channel originally built to drain the marshy land on which the city of Rome stood. Over centuries, it evolved into the backbone of the city's waste management system, receiving runoff from streets, public latrines, baths, and fountains. Roman toilets, or latrinae, appeared in a variety of settings: private homes, apartment blocks, insulae, bathhouses, and military forts. These latrines were usually made of stone or concrete benches with evenly spaced holes. Waste fell into a drainage channel beneath the bench, which was flushed periodically with water from nearby aqueducts. In public latrines, a continuous stream of water sometimes flowed beneath the seats, washing waste away to the main sewers. Despite this efficiency, toilet paper did not exist. Instead, Romans used a sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium, which was dipped in a gutter of running water located at the foot of the toilet bench. This communal tool was shared among users, an unsettling detail for the modern reader, but one that illustrates the different relationship ancient societies had with sanitation and shared space. Public latrines also served as informal meeting places. In the absence of privacy, Romans chatted, exchanged gossip, and conducted informal business while using the facilities. The experience of visiting a latrine was not shameful or hidden, it was part of the rhythm of daily life, like visiting the market or the bathhouse. In fact, some latrines were adorned with mosaics, carvings, and humorous graffiti, poking fun at digestive struggles or complaining about the smell. However, these impressive systems did not serve all Romans equally. The wealthy, with private baths and latrines, enjoyed far greater comfort than the poor, many of whom lived in overcrowded insulae without plumbing. These residents might have used chamber pots, emptied into street drains or cesspits, or relied on public latrines if they were nearby. The water infrastructure of Rome was vast, but not entirely equitable. Water played a central role in Roman sanitation. The empire's famed aqueducts carried water across miles of countryside into urban centers, feeding fountains, baths, and sewers. Yet maintaining this system required an enormous bureaucracy: engineers, inspectors, and a workforce of slaves and laborers kept the water flowing and the drains cleared. Even a momentary lapse in maintenance could lead to backups, flooding, and outbreaks of disease. In fact, many Roman cities across the empire mimicked this model. From Ephesus to Londinium, Roman-style latrines and baths became fixtures of urban planning. The Romans did not merely build for utility, they built for permanence. Stone-lined sewers, tiled floors, and decorative toilets were meant to endure. Still, for all its complexity, Roman sanitation had its limits. The connection between waste and disease was not fully understood, and sewage from latrines often emptied into nearby rivers, streams, or open canals. Drinking water could become contaminated, and outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses were common, especially in military camps or crowded urban quarters. When the Roman Empire began to decline in the West, its sanitation systems gradually deteriorated. Maintenance waned, aqueducts fell into disrepair. Without a centralized state to fund and coordinate upkeep, latrines crumbled and sewers clogged. In many cities, the infrastructure simply collapsed. Stone seats were repurposed, drains filled with debris, and the once grand public toilets became relics of a lost order. Even during its height, sanitation was never flawless. But the ambition was clear. From simple stone holes to sprawling networks of underground channels, ancient societies recognized the fundamental importance of managing waste not just for convenience, but for survival. Sanitation was both a public responsibility and a daily ritual, integrated into how people lived, bathed, prayed, and socialized. It is easy, in hindsight, to focus on the grandeur of ancient Rome, the artistry of Greek temples, or the engineering marvels of the Indus Valley. Yet beneath the temples and markets, running quietly in the background, were systems designed not to glorify the gods or impress visitors, but to move waste efficiently and without fuss. In many ways, those hidden systems reveal as much about a civilization as its literature or monuments. They tell us what people valued when no one was looking. The farther one digs into history, the more it becomes clear. The problem of sanitation was never just about keeping clean. It was about making cities livable, about protecting water, about defining what belonged in public space and what didn't, and most of all, about acknowledging, however boring it might seem, that the most routine aspects of life demand the most careful thought. For all the ingenuity of ancient sanitation systems, from the clay pipes of Mesopotamia to the marble-seated latrines of Rome, the centuries that followed witnessed a striking decline. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West did not just mean political fragmentation or military withdrawal. It also meant the slow decay of the everyday infrastructure that had made urban life tolerable. The careful channeling of waste, once a sign of civic order, began to disappear. Latrines collapsed, sewers clogged. The aqueducts that once carried fresh water into cities were abandoned or dismantled for building material, and in their absence, people found other ways, simpler, dirtier ways, to manage the inescapable. Business of waste in early medieval Europe, with its shifting kingdoms and walled towns. Sanitation returned to something more basic. Chamber pots were common, and their contents were frequently emptied out of windows onto the streets. Cesspits were dug near homes or shared between neighbors. In monasteries and castles, rudimentary latrines were built as small stone protrusions, known as garderobes, little more than enclosed chutes that dropped waste directly into the moat or a pit below. Cities grew without the benefit of sewers. Streets were often unpaved and prone to flooding. Animals roamed freely. Slaughterhouses and tanneries operated within city walls, dumping blood and chemicals into nearby waterways. Human waste joined this slurry, soaking into the ground or running down the cobbled lanes during rain. By the 14th century, the sanitation crisis was severe enough in many European cities that regulations were imposed, ordering waste to be disposed of away from wells or requiring householders to maintain their cesspits, rules that were difficult to enforce. In London, for instance, gong farmers were employed to dig out cesspits during the night, hauling cartloads of human waste, known as night soil, out of the city. It was a dangerous and foul occupation, often carried out in complete darkness. Still, this system, crude though it was, kept cities from drowning in their own refuse. And yet, the deeper knowledge of plumbing and waste management seen in ancient times was largely lost in the West. There were exceptions. Islamic cities, for example, maintained far more consistent sanitation practices throughout the medieval period. In Baghdad, Cordoba, and other centers of learning, public baths, latrines, and flowing water systems remained in use. The connection between cleanliness and both religious piety and health was preserved, and with it, a degree of urban hygiene that far surpassed much of Europe for centuries. The Renaissance revived many ideas from the ancient world: art, architecture, science, but plumbing and sanitation lagged behind. Wealthy homes in the 16th and 17th centuries might have had indoor privies, but waste still relied on gravity and luck. Chamber pots were emptied into yards or alleys. In densely populated areas, the smell of refuse hung in the air year-round, exacerbated by open drains and poor ventilation. One of the turning points in the long arc back toward sanitation came not through invention, but through crisis. In the 19th century, as cities like London, Paris, and New York swelled with industrial growth, the problem of human waste became impossible to ignore. Diseases like cholera and typhoid ravaged the urban poor, and though the exact causes were not fully understood, there was a growing belief that bad air, miasma, emanating from waste and decay, was to blame. It was an incorrect theory, but it led to the right solution. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of raw sewage in the Thames became overwhelming during a hot summer, finally pushed Parliament to act. Civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette was tasked with creating a modern sewer system, and did so with astonishing success. Vast underground brick tunnels were constructed to carry waste out of the city and away from its water supply. The system, completed in the 1870s, is still in use today. Around this time, the flush toilet, a concept first sketched centuries earlier by Sir John Harrington in 1596, began to gain popularity. With running water, U-bend traps, and improved porcelain designs, these toilets offered a cleaner, more private way to handle bodily needs. Manufacturers like Thomas Crapper, whose name, ironically and inaccurately, became slang for the toilet, helped popularize the technology. By the late 19th century, flush toilets were increasingly common in middle-class homes. The change was not just technological, but cultural. Defecation, once a communal act in the latrines of Rome or the shared pits of Deir el-Medina, became a private and segregated activity. The design of homes began to include separate bathrooms. Sanitation became a mark of personal hygiene, respectability, and moral order. By the early 20th century, the modern toilet, ceramic, self-contained, odor-sealed, was becoming standard across much of the industrialized world. Paired with treated water, municipal sewage systems, and indoor plumbing, it represented not just convenience, but a public health triumph. Yet even as the West embraced these changes, much of the world still lacked basic sanitation. In many rural or impoverished areas, latrines remained pit-based, shared, or absent altogether. Disease and contamination persisted. The lessons of antiquity, that sanitation required not just technology, but maintenance, equity, and civic cooperation, were easily forgotten today. Global organizations like the World Health Organization and UNICEF still highlight the lack of access to sanitation as a major health issue. According to recent data, more than 3.5 billion people worldwide do not have access to safely managed sanitation. Open defecation remains a reality in parts of South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Waste contaminates water, spreads disease, and reinforces cycles of poverty. The story of toilets and sanitation, then, is not a straight line from clay pipes to smart toilets. It is cyclical. Civilizations build, decline, forget, and remember. Again, the marvels of the Indus Valley or Roman aqueducts were lost for centuries, only to be rediscovered and reimagined under the pressure of urban expansion and disease. It is also a story of inequality. Sanitation has always been uneven, offered to some and denied to others. Even the most advanced ancient cities reserved their best systems for the elite, and even today, a working toilet remains out of reach for millions. And yet, there is resilience in this history. In every corner of the ancient world, people tried, sometimes with stone, sometimes with clay, sometimes just with determination to carve out dignity and cleanliness in environments that could easily have turned fetid. Their efforts, whether grand sewers or humble pots, show how human beings have always grappled with the mundane and essential tasks of life. Sanitation, though rarely celebrated, is the backbone of every stable society. So the next time you flush a toilet, consider this: you are part of a very old story. One of trial, error, decay, and rebirth. A story written not in golden statues or battlefield victories, but in sewers, drains, and latrine seats. It is not a glamorous tale, but it is one of the most important. The quiet, often forgotten history of how we learned to live together in cities, without drowning in our own waste. Because in the end, civilization is not just measured by temples or technology, it's measured by where we go and what happens after. The bureaucrats of ancient China. There is a tendency, when thinking of ancient empires, to focus on the warriors and the emperors, the dynasties that rose and fell, the walls built and breached, the great conquests, and the dramatic collapses. But in ancient China, a quieter, more persistent force helped hold the empire together across centuries and dynasties. The bureaucrats, not warriors or generals, but men who sat behind wooden desks, read ancient texts, kept ledgers, and wrote letters. They wielded brushes, not swords. They quoted Confucius, cited precedent, and obeyed the flow of ritual and law. These were the scholar officials, the mandarins of China, and their story is as long as it is meticulous. The roots of Chinese bureaucracy stretch back more than 2,000 years, perhaps farther. During the Zhou dynasty, 1046-256 BC, the idea that society should be organized according to a moral and hierarchical order began to take shape. The rulers delegated authority to ministers, who in turn depended on scribes and functionaries. But it was the Qin dynasty, 221-206 BCE, that first forged a truly centralized imperial bureaucracy. Under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the state was reorganized, standardized, and meticulously regulated. This was the dynasty that built the first version of the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, unified the written script, and eliminated hereditary fiefdoms. In its place was something coldly efficient, a command structure divided into districts and provinces, each governed by officials appointed by the emperor himself. But it was not until the Han Dynasty, 206, BC 226, that the ideal of the scholar official truly crystallized. Here, amid stability and expansion, a system emerged that would define Chinese government for almost 2 millennia. The Han rulers, seeking order and continuity, embraced the teachings of Confucius, a philosopher who had lived centuries earlier, and preached a doctrine of duty, virtue, and proper conduct. Confucius did not preach revolution or conquest. He taught about roles, how rulers should rule justly, how sons should obey fathers, and how officials should serve the state with integrity. It was an ideology tailor-made for a bureaucratic empire, and the Han dynasty institutionalized it. From this point forward, government service in China was not just about loyalty. It was about learning to become an official. One did not need to be born into the right family, at least not officially. Instead, one had to study the classics, ancient texts filled with poetry, history, and moral instruction. There was the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the Analects of Confucius, and others. These were not light reading. They required memorization, interpretation, and commentary. And mastery of them marked a man as fit for government by the Sui dynasty 581 to 618 CE, and more fully under the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CE. The Chinese state began to formalize this ideal into a civil service examination system. Candidates, often from the gentry or landowning families, would gather to take a series of grueling written tests. These were not just knowledge checks, they were moral and rhetorical trials. A candidate might be asked to compose an essay on the rectification of names, or to craft a poem in regulated verse about seasonal change. Every word, every brushstroke was judged. Success brought status, employment, and perhaps most importantly, access. A passing grade meant appointment to a position in the imperial bureaucracy, perhaps a post as a magistrate in a rural district, or a clerkship in the capital. Even low-ranking positions came with honor. Higher scores meant better appointments, and in some cases, direct service to the emperor. These officials were the lifeblood of the empire. They recorded taxes, supervised granaries, investigated crimes, managed roads and irrigation, and issued imperial edicts. A village elder might bring a land dispute to a magistrate, who would hear both sides and deliver a judgment in accordance with Confucian principles. A flood might require a local official to assess damages, organize repairs, and report losses. To the capital, nothing moved without paper, and the officials who managed it. They were distinguished by their robes, often dyed in specific colors according to rank, and by their seals, which they used to authenticate documents. In the capital, they inhabited large ministries devoted to different branches of administration: the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Rights, and others. The bureaucracy was a labyrinth, but a logical one. It reflected a worldview in which harmony and order were not just ideals, but procedures. This system was not perfect. Corruption existed. Families with wealth could provide their sons with better tutors, better books, and more time to study. Nepotism could still shape appointments, and yet, compared to many ancient systems, it was remarkably meritocratic. Poor boy from the countryside, if he was brilliant and lucky enough, could rise through study and become a magistrate or even a chancellor in the Tang and Song dynasties. The examination system expanded, and so too did the cultural reverence for scholarship. Entire towns were organized around preparing candidates for the exams. Families built study halls. Teachers became respected elders. The ideal man, the junzi or gentleman, was not a warrior, but a reader. To pass the exam was not just to earn a job, it was to embody a certain kind of morality, a certain calm, practiced diligence. The bureaucracy became a moral institution as much as a practical one. But this created pressures of its own. The competition for official posts was intense. Exams were offered at different levels: prefectural, provincial, and metropolitan. Only a small percentage passed each stage. Some scholars studied for decades without success. Others passed one level but failed the next. And still they studied, their fingers stained with ink, their rooms cluttered with bamboo scrolls and commentary books. Even those who passed could face difficulties. A post in a remote province might mean years of isolation, poor housing, and political tension. A mistaken judgment or a report to the wrong superior could end a career. The bureaucracy demanded not just knowledge, but navigation: how to handle court politics, how to balance justice with imperial will, how to survive the endless flow of reports and petitions. And yet, despite all of this, the system endured. Through the Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols, the Ming, and into the Qing, the bureaucrats remained. Dynasties fell, rebels marched, emperors died, but the scrolls were still read, the exams still taken, the seals still stamped. In one sense, this was the genius of Chinese statecraft. The idea that a government could survive political upheaval if its bureaucracy remained intact. That governance was not about charisma or brute force, but about continuity, the slow, steady work of managing people and resources through trained, literate, morally grounded officials. And so, while the outside world remembers the walls and palaces, the wars and emperors, it is worth pausing here in the quiet halls of examination academies, or the modest offices of district magistrates, to consider the real machinery of empire. It ran not on gold or blood, but on ink, paper, precedent, and ritual. But this raises a deeper question. If the system was so stable and sophisticated, how did it eventually falter? What forces, internal or external, tested the limits of this bureaucratic order? Perhaps your family scrimped and saved for years so you could afford a tutor. Perhaps you spent your childhood hunched over commentaries on the Analects, practicing calligraphy under the dim light of an oil lamp. Perhaps your neighbors called you the quiet one, always buried in scrolls, while others tended fields or stitched clothes. But now, after years of preparation, after passing the prefectural, provincial, and finally the metropolitan examination, you have become a jinshi, a presented scholar. This was the highest honor a scholar official could attain. And yet, it was only the beginning of a life inside the machinery of state. If you were fortunate, your first post might be as an assistant magistrate in a distant province, a dusty outpost hours from the nearest city, home to disputes over water rights and grain shortages. If you were less fortunate, you might be stationed even farther away, in a region still troubled by banditry or the fading echoes of rebellion. Either way, your responsibilities would not be glamorous. The empire needed accountants, not heroes. In fact, most of a magistrate's life was dominated by numbers and reports. Each village was supposed to produce a certain amount of grain, textiles, or labor for the state. You would receive ledgers from the village headman, pages of scribbled characters indicating how many mouths needed feeding, how much rice had been planted, and how many had gone unpaid. You would have to compile all this into a monthly report for your superior in the provincial capital, formatted precisely, signed with your seal, and delivered on time. Beyond paperwork, you also presided over legal matters. In many parts of China, the magistrate served as chief judge, prosecutor, and investigator, all in one. If two families disputed ownership of a plot of land, They brought the matter before you. If a merchant was accused of cheating a farmer, you convened a small court and listened to testimony. Torture was legal in some dynasties, but only under tightly regulated conditions, and only to extract confessions. Still, many magistrates found the system morally difficult to manage. Justice was expected, but so was order. One had to weigh punishment against peace. You were also responsible for maintaining infrastructure. This might mean organizing corvée labor, unpaid work required of local peasants to repair a bridge, dredge an irrigation canal, or reinforce a dike before the rainy season. This could be an unpopular task, and yet it was critical. Floods were one of the greatest threats to food production, and a single broken canal gate could cause famine across an entire district. Then there were the rituals. Every season brought official ceremonies, offerings to Confucius, prayers for rain, reports to the ancestors, inspections of temples. A magistrate was expected to lead these with gravitas and decorum, dressed in the proper robes, accompanied by musicians and officials. If a dragon-shaped incense burner was missing or a ritual phrase misquoted, it could be taken as a sign of disorder or spiritual imbalance. What is striking about this system is its centralized yet dispersed nature. You were the empire in your county, its only official voice, and yet you were watched. Higher officials reviewed your paperwork. Secret inspectors might pass through town posing as travelers, listening to gossip or checking court records. If a complaint reached the capital that you were corrupt or lenient or arrogant, it could mean demotion or worse. To guard against such dangers, most officials cultivated careful habits. Many kept diaries, recording each decision, transaction, or official visit. Some studied old cases, hoping to match the precedents of past dynasties. Others practiced extreme modesty, refusing gifts, avoiding favoritism, and sleeping on simple straw mats. In some dynasties, failure to live frugally could itself be cause for suspicion. After all, how could a modest salary fund silk robes and lacquered furniture? But despite this vigilance, corruption was never far from the surface. China's vast bureaucracy was, in theory, a meritocracy, but in practice, wealth still gave an advantage. The sons of gentry families had access to better tutors and more leisure time to study. Local elites often colluded with officials, providing favors or unofficial payments in exchange for favorable treatment. A tax collector might adjust a ledger to benefit a friend. A merchant might send a gift in advance of an inspection. These things were illegal, but they were hard to prove and harder still to prosecute. Some dynasties tried to combat this with rotation policies. Officials were not allowed to serve in their home provinces to avoid favoritism. Terms were limited, so no magistrate could become too entrenched, and every few years audits were conducted. But these reforms were imperfect. The system was simply too large, too complex, and too dependent on the moral character of individuals. Still, many officials took their duties seriously. They saw themselves as guardians of tradition, pillars of a moral state. They read Confucian texts, not just to pass exams, but to understand how to govern wisely. The ideal was benevolent. Governance to rule not through fear or force, but through virtue, ritual, and correct behavior. This led to an odd tension in Chinese governance. The emperor was absolute. His word was law. Yet most decisions were made locally, by men acting on principle. An official might delay implementing an edict he deemed harmful. Another might submit a memorial, a carefully worded essay, arguing against imperial policy. In rare cases, entire groups of scholars would protest a law, citing Confucian precedent. Sometimes they were punished. Other times, they were heeded. And then, there were the moments when everything broke down. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, plagues, tested the system's limits. When crops failed, peasants starved. And starving peasants could become desperate. Grain storage systems were supposed to prevent this. The state built ever-normal granaries, stockpiling food in good years to release in bad ones. But if a local official failed to report a bad harvest, or if a corrupt merchant stole supplies, the system collapsed. In such times, rebellion could follow. The most famous was the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the late Han Dynasty, when disaffected peasants and mystics rose up, citing neglect and spiritual decay. The central government, slow to respond, was forced to rely on local warlords, and in doing so, began to lose control. The Han collapsed not with a bang, but with paperwork gone missing, roads left unrepaired, laws unenforced. Even in the Ming Dynasty, one of the most bureaucratically sophisticated eras, the cracks showed. Famines led to riots. Court politics strangled reform. The vastness of the empire made quick response impossible. Some officials pleaded for resources to stop disasters that had already happened. By the time reports reached the capital, it was often too late. Yet somehow, the system endured. Why? Partly because it was deeply embedded in Chinese culture. The idea of the Junzi, the cultivated and principled official, was revered. Even those who failed the exams continued to believe in their value. Families displayed portraits of ancestors who had served in office. Local histories recorded the deeds of just magistrates. Scholars published collections of letters and legal opinions, creating a tradition of governance as moral literature. Partly, too, because the alternative was worse. Rule by warlords meant chaos. Rule by merchants meant greed. Rule by foreign powers meant humiliation. The bureaucracy, with all its flaws, at least offered predictability. A bad official might be removed. A good one could make a village thrive, so, for centuries, the bureaucratic machine kept humming, filing papers, collecting taxes, delivering justice. Generations passed through the system like water through a canal, shaped, redirected, absorbed. And yet, as dynasties rose and fell, one question kept surfacing. Could a government truly be moral and efficient at the same time? Could a system, built on virtue, survive a world full of famine, corruption, war, and ambition? It is the late 19th century. China is no longer the sealed, self-assured empire it once was. Foreign powers dock their steamships at coastal cities. British merchants insist on selling opium. German-built railways cross lands once charted by horseback. Japan, once a cultural student of China, has modernized and militarized, defeating Chinese forces in battle. Inside the Forbidden City, the once mighty Qing court debates how to respond to the world changing beyond its walls. But in a dusty provincial town, somewhere far from these headlines, a scholar official still sits at a wooden desk. He has passed the imperial examinations. He wears robes of modest silk and keeps his brush pens in a porcelain jar. On the wall hangs a scroll quoting Mencius. The people are the foundation of the state. His duties are much the same as they were 1,000 years ago, inspecting irrigation ditches, resolving land disputes, and reporting taxes. But something has changed. The empire is still there on paper. The 6 ministries still exist. The civil service examination system still selects officials. yet it all feels strained. The documents pile higher, but their impact lessens. The confidence is gone. What had been an engine of cohesion now feels like a machine in need of oil, still moving, but groaning under its own weight. The seeds of decline were planted long ago. In part, it was the rigidity of tradition. The examination system, so brilliant in conception, had become repetitive. Candidates memorized classical texts and wrote stylized essays, often on ideas that had little to do with the practical challenges of modern governance. Questions about flood control or military reform gave way to discussions of filial piety and ritual rectitude. The bureaucracy became more about reciting the past than planning for the future. Then there was the matter of scale. China's population had grown enormously, but the administrative structure had not kept pace. A single magistrate might be responsible for a district with hundreds of thousands of people. He had a few assistants, perhaps some clerks, but the demands were overwhelming. Local gentry often filled the gaps, using their wealth and influence to sway decisions, sometimes for good, sometimes for gain. As the 19th century progressed, internal crises multiplied. The Taiping Rebellion, a religious political upheaval led by a self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ, tore through southern China in the 1850s. It left tens of millions dead. It wasn't just a rebellion. It was a collapse of faith in the old system. The imperial armies, slow and bureaucratic, couldn't stop it. Instead, the court relied on local militias, raised by officials, breaking a sacred rule of the state, that only the emperor commanded armed force. The precedent, once broken, regional warlords began to rise, even as new officials were selected through the examinations. Their world was changing faster than they could adapt. The West brought railways, telegraphs, steam power, and new ideas about economics, science, and law. China's scholar officials, steeped in Confucian classics, were often ill-prepared for these shifts. Some tried to adapt, introducing reforms, advocating for modernization, studying foreign languages, but others resisted, convinced that China's problems stemmed not from tradition, but from its abandonment. The final blow came in 1905, after centuries of service. The imperial court abolished the civil service examination system. Reformers argued that the exams no longer produced effective officials. They wanted technocrats, engineers, and military officers, not men who could compose poems on ancient rites. The scholar official was now a relic, and yet, even as the system ended, its legacy endured for nearly 2,000 years. The Chinese bureaucracy had shaped more than just governance. It had shaped culture. In a world where most ancient societies valued warriors, landowners, or aristocrats, China had placed its highest honors on scholars. To be literate, to be versed in history and philosophy, to serve the public through knowledge and principle. This was the ideal. In village temples, plaques honored magistrates who ruled wisely. In family homes, portraits of great-grandfathers who passed the exams were revered. In literature, the figure of the upright official, stern yet compassionate, learned yet humble, became a moral archetype. The bureaucracy was not just a job, it was a calling. Even rebellions carried this legacy. Many of the men who opposed dynasties, whether in the name of justice, equality, or revolution, were themselves scholars, trained in the very system they sought to dismantle. They wrote manifestos in classical Chinese. They debated policy in the language of the four books. They were radicals shaped by tradition, and the habits of the bureaucracy lingered. Long after the system fell, in modern China, paperwork remains paramount. Hierarchy is respected. Government officials still dress modestly, speak carefully, and prioritize stability. The notion that power should be exercised through reasoned argument, documentation, and controlled behavior, that didn't vanish in 1905. It simply changed form. Today, scholars look back at the imperial bureaucracy with a mix of admiration and criticism. They note its resilience, how it managed an empire of immense size and complexity, often with surprising effectiveness. But they also note its blind spots, its rigidity, its slowness, its tendency to favor form over substance. But perhaps, more than anything, they recognize its quiet power. In a world often shaped by battles and borders, China's history reminds us of something more subtle, that empires can also be ruled by paper and principle. That order can come not from force, but from the daily work of record-keeping, dispute resolution, and moral education. That civilization is not always loud. Sometimes it sits behind a desk, brush in hand, writing yet another report. Prompt 1. A Viking longhouse, nestled in snowy tundra under a twilight sky. Smoke curling gently from the turf roof as stars glimmer faintly above. Warm golden light glowing through the door crack, late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum, flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines, subtle parchment texture, 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 2. Interior of a Viking longhouse at night. Family members huddled around a central hearth with low flames, goats lying nearby. Timber walls faintly steaming. Firelight casting flickering shadows. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution. 4K prompt 3. A woman mending a wool tunic by stone oil lamp. Her fingers red from cold, to children beside her spinning yarn. Shadows dancing on the rough timber walls. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell. Gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution. 4K prompt 4. A young boy collecting dried dung in a wicker basket from a lean-to. Snow drifting around him as he wraps his cloak tight. Fur hood drawn low. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 5. A steaming pot of root vegetable stew hanging over a hearth pit, thick. Porridge and dried flatbread arranged nearby on wooden platters. Faint haze of smoke above late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 6. A. Figure melting snow in an iron cauldron over low flame while bundled in layers of teal and russet wool. Frost curling on the wooden beams behind late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution. 4K prompt 7. Children sitting at their grandmother's feet, wide-eyed as she tells a tale of Odin and the frost giants. firelight catching the gilded threads of her cloak. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution. 4K prompt 8. A small altar near the hearth, with offerings of mead and bread beside a carved wooden idol. Soft glow of embers illuminating delicate, gilded accents. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 9. A solemn Yule scene with pine logs burning brightly. Family gathered close under flickering oil lamps. Gentle snow falling outside the turf-roofed hall. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution. 4K prompt 10. A thrall hauling water in wooden buckets through deep snow, face red from wind, passing tethered livestock under a pale dawn sky. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 11. The Bond seated at a carved wooden table, tallying sacks of grain and dried fish by lamplight, furs draped around his shoulders. Others watching silently. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 12. A child gently banking the hearth fire with ash at night. Small hand holding. Iron tongs, others asleep under straw-stuffed blankets in the background. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 13. Interior of a root cellar lit by candle. Bins of turnips and onions stacked with straw lining the floor. Hanging meat glistening faintly with frost. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 14. Two families gathered in a smoky longhouse during a blizzard, seated close together, sharing food and warmth in wary but peaceful truce. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 15. An elder mixing herbal remedies of yarrow and angelica near a sick child. Steam from a pot rising as others look on anxiously in the dim warmth. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript miniature. Tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. Fine brown ink outlines. Subtle parchment texture. 16:9 aspect. Ultra high resolution 4K prompt 16. A small group watching the stars outside their longhouse on a rare, clear night. Cloaked figures pointing at the sky. Moonlight glinting on frozen snow. Late 15th century illuminated manuscript. Miniature, tempera and shell gold on vellum. Flat medieval perspective. fine brown ink outlines, subtle parchment texture, 16:9 aspect, ultra high resolution 4K.